Just who do you think you are? The question hung in the air, immediately followed by a wave of laughter, sharp, practiced, utterly devoid of kindness. A woman, draped in a scarlet gown that screamed wealth, the diamonds around her neck heavy enough to anchor a small ship, leaned forward. Her manicured finger, gleaming under the ballroom's lights, stabbed the air, singling out one guest with cruel precision. Beside her, her husband. His silver hair slicked back like a predatory animal's, nearly sloshed his wine as he erupted in a bark of laughter. His teeth, perfectly white and undoubtedly expensive, flashed, his chest shaking with forced mirth. The entire crowd, as if on cue, pivoted to witness the spectacle. This wasn't amusement born of a witty joke. This was something far uglier. They were laughing at her. The target of their scorn stood motionless, a figure of serene defiance amidst the opulent chaos. A black woman, elegant in a gown that spoke of power through its very simplicity. No gaudy sequins, no distracting sparkle. Just lines so impeccably tailored that the room itself seemed to hold its breath around her. Beside her stood a man, a rock in the storm. Midnight blue tuxedo, jaw set with unwavering determination. His eyes, dark and intense, cutting through the room like lasers. His shoulders were squared, as though he were physically absorbing the weight of every judgmental stare directed at them. Champagne flutes, poised midair in countless hands, paused in their trajectory. Conversations, moments before a cacophony of shallow pleasantries, stumbled into an uneasy silence. Smartphones, the modern-day weapons of choice, hovered, ready to capture the unfolding drama. The ballroom, once a glittering haven celebrating philanthropic generosity, had been instantly transformed into a modern-day coliseum, where social hierarchies were brutally enforced. Two predators, their faces masks of smug superiority, circling their prey. Two targets, standing unshaken. "Tell me?" The woman in red purred again, her smile stretched too wide, revealing a glimpse of something deeply unpleasant. Her tone dripped with condescending mockery. "Just who extended an invitation for you to grace us with your presence in this room?" The laughter swelled, gaining momentum, a wave of sound intended to crush. But the woman in white remained unmoved. She didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. Her silence, in the face of such blatant hostility, was far louder than any shouted retort could have been. Her gaze remained locked forward, unwavering, and that very composure only seemed to amplify the sting of the insults for everyone watching. The man beside her shifted almost imperceptibly, his hand brushing against hers, a subtle, almost telepathic signal. We've navigated these treacherous waters before. Her nearly invisible nod was a silent acknowledgement. And we'll handle it now, the same way we always do. From the periphery of the scene, a young server froze mid-step, the tray laden with sparkling wine trembling in his grip. His eyes darted back and forth, caught between the mocking laughter and the almost unervingly calm figure refusing to break. He wasn't the only one experiencing a crisis of conscience. Two guests near the back of the ballroom exchanged furtive glances, one of them whispering, barely audible above the rising tide of derision. Are they really doing this? Here? But the woman in red, fueled by the attention, pressed on, oblivious to the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. "This isn't your crowd, darling. Not your table. Certainly not your night." She delivered the line with theatrical flair, and smirked. "Security should really take care of people like you." She lifted her glass to her lips with the casual arrogance of someone utterly convinced that the room, and everything within it, belonged to her. The black woman in white finally tilted her head, an almost imperceptible movement, her eyes gleaming with an inner fire beneath the dazzling chandeliers. A quiet storm gathered, a silence that promised an answer far more devastating than anyone present was prepared to hear. And before we continue this unfolding drama, let us ask, from where are you watching this scene unfold? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in the inherent value of dignity and justice, show your support by hitting like and subscribing. These stories are sparks to ignite a change, and we are so grateful you are here. Now, back to her, because tonight, within the confines of this very ballroom, the laughter that sought to humiliate her would be utterly drowned out by something far more powerful, the resounding sound of truth. The laughter still echoed, bouncing off the cold marble walls and glittering crystal chandeliers, but it no longer carried the same weight. The woman in white did not flinch. She stood rooted, spine perfectly straight, her eyes betraying no emotion. To everyone else in that room, she was simply a stranger, perhaps a gatecrasher, attempting to blend in with borrowed elegance. But to herself, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her name was Maya Caldwell, 42 years old, founder and CEO of Caldwell Global Holdings, a company whose name alone carried significant weight in the boardrooms of New York, London, and Dubai. Tonight, however, she had deliberately chosen not to lead with her title. She arrived without her usual entourage, without her ever-present press team, without the protective aura of power that typically preceded her. She wore white deliberately, a blank canvas of clean, sharp, unadorned power. Not a single ostentatious jewel, save for the modest diamond studs in her ears. No designer logo screaming for validation. Just fabric, impeccably cut and tailored to perfection. Simplicity transformed into quiet defiance. The kind of gown that silently whispered, "I don't need to prove my worth to you." At her side, her husband, Jordan, radiated the same quiet strength. His tuxedo was immaculate, yet understated. A black silk tie, knotted with quiet confidence. He wasn't there to draw attention to himself. He was there to anchor her, to provide unyielding support while the room attempted to shake her foundations. To the rest of the gala attendees, they simply looked out of place. No flashy introductions, no familiar last names from the city's exclusive social pages. Just two figures standing firm amidst the glitter and noise. And that, for some, was enough to trigger suspicion and ultimately hostility. Maya had witnessed this exact scene play out before, countless times throughout her career. At 25, she walked into her first investors' gala in Atlanta wearing a thrifted black dress and was immediately asked if she was with the catering staff. At 32 in London, a man in a velvet blazer inquired, with thinly veiled condescension, whose assistant she was. At 39, she was mistaken for a guest driver while waiting outside the Waldorf Astoria. Tonight, the faces were different, but the underlying energy was sickeningly familiar. Disbelief dressed up as faux superiority. Her silence, therefore, was not born of weakness or fear. It was memory layered upon memory, forging an invisible armor, impenetrable to everyone else in the room. Jordan shifted slightly closer, his voice low and controlled, meant only for her ears. "Same playbook," he murmured, his eyes never leaving the couple in red. Maya's lips curved, almost imperceptibly, just enough to register as a knowing smile. It wasn't for them. It was for herself, for the quiet confidence of knowing that she already knew how this would all ultimately end. Behind them, the young waiter, his hands still trembling slightly, steadied his tray, his eyes flickering nervously at the powerful couple being cornered. He recognized her. He couldn't immediately place the name, but he had definitely seen her face before on the cover of a magazine in the barbershop, a place where news lingered for weeks, dog-eared and slightly faded. The flicker of recognition sat in his chest, a secret he wasn't sure he was brave enough to voice. Across the room, a junior associate from one of the hedge funds whispered to his colleague, his voice dripping with dismissive certainty, "She's nobody. Just watch." The colleague glanced once more at Maya, a frown creasing his brow, an uneasy feeling that something about the situation didn't quite add up. The couple in red carried on, emboldened by the gathering audience, smirking, sipping their champagne, feeding the room's insatiable appetite for humiliation. But the very air in the ballroom was already subtly shifting. The chandeliers still glowed, the violinists still played their sweet melodies, yet an undercurrent of tension pulsed beneath the surface of the glamour. Guests leaned in closer, sensing that the silence emanating from the woman in white wasn't submission, but rather the slow burn of a fuse. And when that fuse finally burned out, the resulting blast would irrevocably rearrange the entire room. The violinists, bless their oblivious hearts, never missed a note, but the music itself had subtly changed. Not on their instruments, but within the very atmosphere of the room. What had been a light background melody now felt like a cruel mockery, sweet notes laced over a sour and deeply unsettling scene. The woman in scarlet leaned in again. Her perfume, an overpowering blend of floral and something vaguely predatory, thick in the air. Her laughter was now sharp enough to draw even more faces from across the ballroom. "It's almost cute," she said loudly, as if she wanted the chandeliers themselves to bear witness to her wit. "Every year there's someone who sneaks in hoping for the free champagne. This one even bothered to dress up for it." She raised her glass, the effervescent bubbles rising like pathetic proof of her own superiority. Her husband, his silver hair catching the light in a way that made him look almost demonic, eagerly added fuel to the fire. "Next time, maybe they'll try the kitchen. At least there, no one would notice." His laugh rolled out, heavy, rehearsed, and deeply ugly. Around them, small clusters of guests began to coalesce, drawn by the irresistible scent of spectacle. Pearls glistened, cufflinks flashed. But it was the eyes, the surreptitious stares, the narrowing looks that thickened the air with palpable tension. Some were amused, others cautious. Some were simply hungry for the humiliation about to unfold. Maya didn't move. Jordan stood firm beside her, an unyielding presence. Their stillness was both a shield and a sword, but it only seemed to further feed the crowd's appetite. Silence, in this rarefied atmosphere, was immediately interpreted as weakness, and weakness was a feast just waiting to be consumed. "Security," the woman in scarlet called out casually, tilting her chin imperiously toward the far end of the hall. "We seem to have a bit of a problem here. Someone seems to have wandered into the wrong party." Her words landed like stones, skipping across the surface of a pond, each ripple pulling more attention to the scene. A young man in a tailored navy suit raised an eyebrow, his expression conveying a mixture of surprise and disapproval. "Really? At a * charity gala? *," he muttered under his breath. His date shushed him, visibly uneasy, but not before her eyes flicked toward Maya, registering a spark of recognition she couldn't quite place. The waiter from earlier clutched his tray even tighter, his knuckles white. He had abandoned all pretense of not watching. Now, his gaze darted back and forth from Maya to the couple mocking her, his throat working as if he desperately wanted to speak, but couldn't quite summon the courage. Meanwhile, the crowd continued to swell. Conversations stuttered and died, replaced by expectant silence. Smartphones rose discreetly, their tiny red recording dots blooming like fireflies in the twilight. A scene was undeniably forming, and everyone wanted a piece of it. The man in silver hair took a deliberate step closer, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the cold marble floor. He smirked, his eyes glinting with malice. "Do you hear that?" he asked Maya directly, his voice dripping with condescension. "That's the sound of a room collectively deciding that you simply don't belong." He swirled the wine in his glass as if it were irrefutable evidence of her transgression, then leaned back with a satisfied grin. Jordan shifted his weight, a subtle sign of his mounting anger, but Maya touched his arm lightly, a silent command to hold. Her face remained unreadable, carved from an almost otherworldly calm. A woman across the room whispered, just a little too loudly, "She clearly doesn't look like she belongs here. Not in that dress. Not in this room." Her companion echoed the sentiment with a venomous glance. The circle tightened, each judgmental stare a physical weight pressing down on Maya. Their words had become the very air itself, thick with doubt and heavy with dismissal. The couple in scarlet smiled like royalty surveying their domain, utterly confident that they controlled the narrative of the scene. But beneath the glittering chandeliers, beneath the polished marble and crystal, another, far more powerful, current was beginning to rise. Maya's silence was not a sign of collapse. It was a carefully controlled countdown. And every insult, every laugh, every whispered judgment was a tick closer to the explosion they so foolishly believed would never come. The laughter didn't fade. Instead, it thickened, becoming almost oppressive. Like smoke filling the ballroom, it pressed against skin and collarbones, testing to see who would be the first to cough, to break, to show a flicker of weakness. Maya did not cough. She did not speak. With steady fingers, she reached for the champagne flute from a passing tray, lifted it gracefully, and allowed the golden liquid to catch the chandelier's light. Then, she sipped slowly, deliberately, her movements unhurried and precise. Her silence swallowed their laughter whole, like velvet smothering steel. Jordan, at her side, mirrored her unwavering calm. His shoulders remained squared, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his hand resting lightly at his side. No clenched fists, no outward defiance, just an unshakable composure, the kind that unnerves far more effectively than shouting ever could. The woman in scarlet tilted her head, her smile faltering ever so slightly. She had expected protest, embarrassment, perhaps even tears. Instead, she found only stillness, the kind of stillness that transforms a crowded room into a silent witness stand. She's not answering because she knows she doesn't belong, the man with silver hair announced, his voice attempting to fill the awkward silence with a bluster of confidence. He desperately wanted it to sound like a declaration of victory. To some, it did, but to others, it rang hollow, like insecurity dressed in borrowed bravado. Maya lowered her glass, her eyes sweeping across the room, taking in every detail. She didn't meet their gaze with fiery anger. She met it with ice-cold resolve, calm, unflinching, a perfect mirror reflecting back every smirk and sneer. The kind of look that silently said, "I've been here before, and I'll be here long after you're gone." Near the back, the young waiter shifted his weight, his hands trembling slightly less than before. He stared at Maya, his chest rising and falling as if he were drawing courage from her very silence. A guest in pearls whispered, her voice tinged with confusion, "Why isn't she saying anything?" Her companion leaned in conspiratorially. "Because she has nothing to say. She's been cornered." But the room as a whole wasn't so sure. Something about the woman in white didn't quite fit the script they were so eagerly trying to write for her. She wasn't shrinking. She wasn't flustered. She was waiting. Jordan leaned slightly toward her, his voice low, intimate, meant only for her ear. Same story, different room. Maya's lips barely moved, just the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. "And the same ending," she whispered back. The woman in scarlet bristled, raising her glass even higher, her movements becoming increasingly agitated. "Enjoy the champagne while you can," she snapped, her voice laced with forced triumph. "Security will be here any minute now." Her words were intended to intimidate, but her eyes darted just once toward Maya's still unreadable face, betraying a flicker of unease. Maya didn't flinch. She didn't offer a single word of defense. She simply allowed the silence to hold the immense weight of every insult hurled her way, and the silence grew heavier, more oppressive, as phones tilted higher and the tiny red recording dots bloomed even brighter. Guests leaned forward, a palpable tension pulling them closer, unable to tear their gaze away from the unfolding drama. Some smiled, eager for the impending spectacle. Others frowned, sensing a growing imbalance they couldn't yet fully articulate. But everyone, without exception, knew one thing. This was far from over. Maya had said nothing, and yet, somehow, she had already fundamentally shifted the entire room. The ballroom had become a stage, and the heavy silence that hung between Maya and her tormentors was the only spotlight that mattered. Every breath, every glance, every deliberate sip of champagne only amplified the intensity of the performance. Near the edge of the room, the young waiter could no longer pretend he wasn't watching. His tray wobbled precariously once, then steadied as he fixed his gaze on Maya. Something about her unwavering stillness pulled him in, an invisible force like gravity. He remembered her face, suddenly crystal clear, on a magazine cover in the barbershop, buried beneath layers of sports and car magazines. He hadn't actually read the article, but he remembered the headline, something about a quiet force driving global shifts. The memory flared now like a match struck in the darkness, illuminating the truth. A few tables away, a pair of guests in sleek evening wear whispered urgently to each other. One of them, a junior analyst from a hedge fund, leaned forward, his face etched with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. "Should I be recording this? This feels wrong." His companion, a woman with sharp, calculating eyes, subtly nudged her phone further under the table, her fingers already tapping the record button without a word. The red dot glowed ominously against her sequined clutch. Across the ballroom, a middle-aged man tugged nervously at his bow tie and muttered to no one in particular, "Not a good look. Not here. Not tonight." His date frowned, but remained silent, torn between her own discomfort and the magnetic pull of the unfolding scandal. The couple in scarlet, acutely aware of the shifting atmosphere, noticed the subtle changes in the air. Their smiles tightened, their laughter growing just a little louder and more forced than before, as if sheer volume could somehow mask the growing unease crawling at the edges of the crowd. "Don't just stand there." The woman in scarlet snapped toward the nearest staff member, her voice laced with impatience. "Where's security? Get them over here now." Her voice cracked slightly, a high-pitched note of desperation slipping through her carefully constructed facade. But no one moved. Instead, more and more eyes turned toward Maya. Her white gown caught the chandelier's light, transforming her into a figure of almost ethereal power. She stood motionless, a figure carved from unwavering calm, while the room silently rearranged itself around her oppressive silence. The waiter finally lowered his tray to a side table with a soft thud. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his decision heavy in his lungs. "This isn't right," he whispered, barely audible, though no one close enough seemed willing to echo his sentiment. A woman with pearls near the back raised her phone higher, her fingers trembling slightly. "If they try to throw her out," she muttered under her breath, "the whole world is going to see it." Her friend tugged nervously at her wrist, but didn't actually stop her from recording. The man in silver hair barked out another laugh, but this one sounded strained, almost panicked. "Too sharp, too forced. Look at her. She's practically paralyzed. Doesn't even know how to answer." His words bounced off the marble and crystal, but their weight didn't land the way he desperately wanted it to. Too many faces were no longer laughing. Too many phones were capturing the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Maya lifted her glass again, her movements unhurried and unshaken, her eyes sweeping across the crowd once more. This time, her gaze locked with the young waiters. For the briefest of seconds, she nodded a tiny, precise acknowledgement that conveyed a wealth of meaning. "I see you. I know you see me." His throat tightened, and the secret recognition grew heavier in his chest. And for the first time that night, the balance of the room shifted not with an insult, but with the silent power of a witness. The story was no longer solely theirs to control. It was being recorded, whispered, shared in real time. And soon, those witnesses would no longer remain silent. The ballroom's golden glow seemed to dim in spirit, even as the chandeliers continued to pour light like liquid fire. What had begun as mocking whispers now swelled into fully formed voices, each one adding to the growing sense of unease. The air buzzed with unspoken tension, and a palpable dread draped over the gala like an unwanted curtain. From near the stage, a tall, imposing man in a velvet dinner jacket stepped forward. His name was Charles Denton, the event chair, a longtime donor to the charity, a man whose voice often carried the unquestioned weight of final authority at gatherings like this. He had been watching the unfolding drama from a distance, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Now he approached, his heels clicking crisply on the polished marble, and the crowd instinctively parted before him. "Enough," he said loudly, his deep baritone voice cutting through the escalating chatter. His gaze, cold and unwavering, locked directly on Maya. "I don't know how you managed to slip into this room, but this gala is exclusively for benefactors and verified guests. You're holding up the evening. Gasps rippled across the floor, and a few phones tilted even higher. Charles wasn't a mere sideshow act like the couple in scarlet. He was the embodiment of authority, the voice of established legitimacy. His words carried weight, and everyone in the room knew it. And yet, as he stared down at Maya, dismissing her very presence with a single sentence, a different kind of weight settled on the room. A creeping sense of discomfort, a nagging feeling that something profoundly wrong was taking place. The woman in scarlet smirked in triumph, gesturing as if to say, "See, even Charles agrees." Her husband chuckled, emboldened by the backing of someone with genuine social status. "Told you, doesn't belong here." But Maya remained perfectly still, her face composed and unreadable. She allowed the accusation to wash over her without flinching, her silence unnerving Charles more than he had anticipated. His brow furrowed, betraying his growing irritation. Jordan shifted slightly beside her, his jaw tightening, but once again, Maya's light touch on his sleeve held him steady. The quiet restraint was maddening for those expecting a dramatic scene, but magnetic for those who were beginning to see the injustice of the situation with increasing clarity. A guest near the front row whispered sharply, her voice betraying a sudden realization. "That's Maya Caldwell, isn't it?" Her companion frowned, shaking his head in disbelief. "Can't be. If it was her, they'd recognize her, wouldn't they?" The seed of doubt had been planted, and it lingered in the air like smoke. Charles stepped closer, lowering his tone slightly, but not his inherent arrogance. "If you can't present valid credentials immediately," he said, his voice cold and measured, "I'll have security escort you from the premises." His words were cold, procedural, the kind that carried the unyielding echo of institutional policy. At the back, the waiter swallowed hard, his throat aching with the words he desperately wanted to shout. He wanted to call out the name he now remembered so clearly, to expose the charade for what it was, but paralyzing fear still pinned him silent. Still, his eyes never left Maya. The pearl-clad woman, still recording everything, muttered into her phone's microphone, her voice shaking slightly. "He just threatened her with security. This is unreal." The couple in scarlet clanked their glasses together as if toasting her impending downfall. Finally, the woman in red took a deep breath and muttered, attempting to restore order to the chaos. "Order in the room. Please, let's not make a scene." But order wasn't what the room felt. It felt like the suffocating calm before a storm. Unease rippled wider now, slipping beneath the skin and making hands tremble on fragile wine stems. Maya raised her glass once more, her movements slow and deliberate. Her silence was now far louder than Charles's show of authority. The crowd leaned in, restless and expectant, the tension in the air now almost unbearable. The escalation had reached its breaking point. The next move would irrevocably decide whether the night would descend into further cruelty and injustice, or would somehow be transformed into something unforgettable. The ballroom no longer shimmered with its former ease. The chandeliers still blazed with their brilliant light, but the air beneath them was brittle, stretched taut, ready to snap at any moment. Every guest could feel it. This was no longer a playful exercise in social humiliation. This was something far harsher, far more dangerous. Charles Denton stepped closer, his velvet jacket brushing against Maya's gown as he loomed over her, his face flushed with anger. "Enough games," he said, his voice sounding like the sharp crack of a gavel. "If you can't or won't show proof that you belong here, then you simply don't belong here." He stretched out his hand, palm flat and expectant, a gesture that brooked no argument. "Your invitation, now." Maya's gaze lowered briefly to his outstretched hand, then lifted back to meet his eyes, her expression calm and unwavering. She didn't move, her defiance a silent challenge. Her stillness enraged him. "Fine," Charles snapped, his patience finally exhausted. He turned his head sharply toward the nearest staff member, his voice ringing with imperious command. "Take her glass. If she's not a guest, she has absolutely no right to partake in our hospitality." Gasps cut through the air, and a junior attendant hesitated, his eyes wide with fear, the tray in his grip trembling precariously. He took one slow, hesitant step toward Maya, then stopped abruptly, frozen under the intensity of her quiet stare. The stare wasn't overtly hostile. It was commanding, almost regal. The attendant's hand dropped back to his side, defeated. The woman in scarlet laughed, her voice shrill and triumphant. If she won't hand over an invitation, maybe she should just hand over her purse. That will tell us who she really is. A few guests murmured uncomfortably. That's going too far, one man muttered, but others smirked, clearly entertained by the escalating drama. Their phones angled even closer to capture every humiliating detail. Jordan's jaw flexed, his knuckles white as he clenched his fist. His hand twitched toward his pocket, but Maya's touch restrained him again. Her quiet restraint was far more dangerous than any explosive outburst could ever be. Charles, his face now crimson with indignation, reached for the champagne glass still clutched firmly in Maya's hand. "Then I'll simply remove you myself," he hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. His fingers closed around the delicate stem of the glass. For a brief, heart-stopping heartbeat, it was a silent tug-of-war, a battle of wills waged without a single word. The crystal glass, fragile and delicate, was caught between them, his grip insistent and forceful, her steady and unyielding as stone. The sound, when it finally came, was sharp enough to slice the entire room in half. The delicate stem snapped, sending shards of crystal scattering across the polished marble floor like glittering ice. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd, and phones shook in the hands of those recording everything. Maya didn't flinch. Champagne dripped onto the hem of her pristine white gown, the golden liquid stark against the white silk, but her face remained composed, carved from unyielding steel. The man in silver hair seized the moment, his voice booming over the murmurs of the crowd, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "Call the police. She's trespassing, stealing our time and our space. People like her always think they can just slip in and take what doesn't belong to them." The hateful words hung in the air like poison, infecting the atmosphere. A woman near the back gasped audibly, and someone else whispered, their voice barely audible, "Did he really just say, people like her?" The young waiter's fists clenched tighter at his sides. The words he had been holding back almost broke free, but again, he swallowed them down, forcing himself to remain silent, for now. Charles gestured sharply toward the exit, his face contorted with barely controlled rage. "Security, remove her now." But no guards moved. Their radios buzzed softly at their hips, but their feet remained firmly planted on the floor. Even they could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the palpable unease of being recorded, the growing awareness that this moment was no longer confined to the privacy of the ballroom. The scarlet woman's smile faltered slightly as she realized that the laughter had thinned, the once raucous chorus now echoing only between herself, her husband, and the woman they had so gleefully attempted to humiliate. Maya stood in the center of it all, surrounded by the glittering shards of crystal, champagne soaking her gown, but utterly unshaken. Her silence weighed far more than Charles's fading authority, more than the petty insults, more than the broken glass. The humiliation they had so confidently sought to inflict had only served to draw every eye in the room even more intensely upon her. The breaking point had finally been reached, and the room was about to learn, in the most dramatic way possible, exactly whom they had so foolishly tried to erase. The shards of crystal still glittered ominously across the marble floor, but Maya stood unmoved, the champagne sliding down the silk of her gown like liquid gold, stubbornly refusing to stain. The crowd waited, breathless, for her to finally crack for tears, for a hasty retreat, for an explosion of rage. But none came. Instead, she lifted her hand, elegant and precise, and touched Jordan's wrist. One subtle, almost imperceptible signal. His phone was already in his palm before most of the guests even realized he had moved. A murmur swept through the room, and the couple in scarlet leaned forward, their expressions expectant. Charles Denton sneered, his face contorted with contempt. "Yes, call whoever you like. It won't change the fact that you simply don't belong here. But Maya wasn't calling for help or reinforcements. She was calling for something far more powerful. She was calling for order. Jordan pressed the screen once, then handed the phone to her. She placed it against her ear, her voice steady and perfectly audible for those nearest to catch every word. "Marcus," she said softly, her tone betraying no emotion whatsoever. "Activate the protocol. Timestamp this exact moment. I want the full audit, live." On the other end of the line, a crisp, professional voice answered without hesitation. "Understood, Ms. Caldwell. The system is ready." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, sending ripples of confusion and apprehension through the nearby guests. Asterisk protocol? Audit? What in the world did that mean? The waiter froze, his eyes widening with sudden realization. Maya lowered the phone slightly, but didn't end the call. "Stay on the line," she instructed, her voice still perfectly calm. Then, her gaze swept slowly across the crowd, missing nothing, her voice carrying with unwavering certainty, her stance rock solid. Not a tremor in her voice, not a flicker of fear in her stance. The woman in scarlet tried to force another laugh, but the sound cracked midair, sounding hollow and pathetic. "What's that supposed to mean?" she demanded, her voice shrill and defensive. "Some imaginary assistant?" Jordan finally spoke, his deep baritone calm and cutting, silencing the woman with a single sentence. "Imaginary assistants don't answer calls in real time, darling." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Doubt began to spread like ink in clear water. The pearl-clad woman, still recording everything, raised her phone even higher. "She's logging it," she whispered into her microphone, her voice trembling slightly. "Everything they're saying, every single word. It's all on the record." Charles Denton's face flushed even deeper, turning almost purple with a combination of anger and dawning fear. "Ridiculous," he barked, attempting to dismiss her words with a wave of his hand. "Audits? Logs? This is a gala, not a courtroom. Stop pretending you're someone important." But the oppressive silence that followed his outburst didn't support his blustering denial. Too many people had stopped smirking. Too many phones had captured the subtle, yet unmistakable, break in his carefully crafted composure. Maya spoke again, each word deliberate and precise, her voice carrying with unwavering conviction. "Every second of this is being documented," she said, her gaze sweeping across the faces in the crowd. "Every insult, every gesture, every accusation. If you're so certain that I don't belong here, then stand by those words when they're reviewed. Be prepared to justify your actions when the full account of tonight is laid bare for everyone to see." The crowd shifted uneasily, a tangible wave of fear washing over them. The weight of being witnessed, not just by those present in the ballroom, but by the impact of Maya's words reverberated, the realization of who held the strings on the other end of Jordan's phone call finally hitting home. The woman in the scarlet gown, her face a mask of crumbling composure, trembled as she lifted her champagne flute, the delicate crystal threatening to shatter in her grasp. "She's bluffing?" she hissed to her husband, her voice a desperate whisper barely audible above the suddenly subdued murmur of the crowd, though her eyes betrayed the seeds of doubt that had already taken root. Mia, a figure of quiet defiance in her pristine white gown, took a single, deliberate step forward, the delicate fabric of her dress whispering over shards of broken glass, a testament to the shattered pretense of the evening. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. Her words, though spoken with a deceptive calm, cut through the tension like a shard of ice. "You wanted to erase me," she stated, her tone as cold and unwavering as granite. "Now you've written yourselves into history instead." The room collectively gasped, a single unified intake of breath that hung suspended in the air, the anticipated exhale never materializing. For the first time that night, the balance of power was shifting, subtly, inexorably, like the tide turning against a fragile sandcastle. An almost palpable sense of unease pulsed through the ballroom, each heartbeat a drumbeat of dawning recognition. Phones, previously brandished as weapons of social validation, now hovered higher, their screens illuminating anxious faces. Champagne glasses, once symbols of celebration, trembled in manicured hands, their contents sloshing precariously. The effervescent laughter that had moments before filled the ballroom, a soundtrack to the lavish spectacle, had collapsed into nervous whispers and hushed static. Maya, her movements deliberate and controlled, lowered Jordan's phone, placing it calmly onto the nearest table as though she were setting down a finely crafted dagger. Its purpose served. She didn't need it anymore. The silence, heavy and expectant, belonged to her now, a tangible manifestation of her reclaimed authority. From the stage, the master of ceremonies, a figure suddenly diminished, nervously adjusted his microphone, his gaze darting anxiously across the crowd before settling on his notes. Clearing his throat, he spoke, his voice carrying, uncertain at first, then gathering strength with each word. Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue with tonight's auction, we would like to acknowledge our primary benefactor. His eyes widened incrementally as he read the name on the card, his carefully rehearsed demeanor momentarily fracturing. Miss Maya Caldwell, founder and chairwoman of Caldwell Global Holdings. The words detonated across the ballroom, a verbal explosion that shattered the carefully constructed facade of the evening. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a wave of murmurs, a collective shiver of realization that spread from wall to wall. Heads swiveled sharply, drawn like magnets toward the woman in white, the one who had stood so still, so composed, absorbing every insult, every veiled slight, without so much as a flinch. A young waiter, his face etched with a mixture of shock and dawning understanding, dropped his tray, the sound of silver crashing against the marble floor echoing through the stunned silence. "I knew it," he whispered, his voice breaking into the sudden void, the revelation bubbling up from some deep well of intuition. "I knew that face," the pear-shaped woman gasped audibly, her eyes wide with horrified recognition. "Oh my God. She's the one funding this entire gala." Phones pivoted in unison, lenses locking onto Maya as if the reveal itself demanded to be broadcast to the world, each device capturing her every nuance, every subtle shift in expression. Charles Denton's jaw hung slack, his face, moments before flushed with indignation and self-importance, now drained of all color, leaving him looking pale and deflated. "No," he muttered, his voice barely audible, his denial laced with disbelief. "That's impossible." The woman in scarlet staggered back a step, her carefully crafted smile dissolving like sugar in water, replaced by a look of abject dismay. Her husband's wine glass trembled in his hand, the red liquid sloshing precariously close to the pristine white cuff of his shirt. Their triumph, their carefully constructed edifice of social superiority, had turned to ash in their throats, leaving a bitter taste of regret and impending consequences. Maya stepped forward, each footfall deliberate and measured, shards of broken crystal crunching beneath her heels, a sound that amplified the tension in the room. Her voice, though calm and low, carried with the force of thunder, each word a precise and devastating strike. "You demanded my invitation," she stated, her gaze unwavering. "This gala exists because of my invitation." She allowed her words to hang in the air, suspended like a judgment, long enough for every guest to feel its weight, to understand the full implications of their actions. "Caldwell Global pledged $20 million to tonight's fund," she continued, her voice resonating with quiet authority. "Your programs, your research, your scholarships, every single one of them depends on that support. And yet, here I stand, treated as an intruder, as someone who doesn't belong." Her eyes moved slowly across the room, not lingering on Charles, nor the scarlet-clad couple, but sweeping over the entire assembly, holding each gaze, forcing every face to absorb the weight of her words, to confront the collective complicity in the evening's events. "This is not the first time," she stated, her voice steady, devoid of self-pity, yet filled with an unshakable resolve. "At 25, I was mistaken for a caterer. 32, an assistant. At 39, a driver. Tonight, at 42, still the same story." She paused, the silence vibrating with tension, anticipation hanging heavy in the air. "But tonight," she declared, her voice imbued with a steely determination. "Tonight, it ends." The crowd exhaled as one, a collective expulsion of breath that sounded like wind tearing through dry leaves, a release of the pent-up tension that had been building throughout the evening. Guests looked at one another, shame flickering in some eyes, awe in others, the carefully constructed veneer of social indifference momentarily cracking. Jordan finally stepped forward, his presence radiating strength and unwavering support, his voice deep and resonant, a counterpoint to Maya's controlled calm. "You questioned whether she belonged," he stated, his words carrying the weight of undeniable truth. "Now ask yourselves, why do you?" His words landed like a hammer blow, shattering the remaining vestiges of pretense. The ballroom shook, not with noise, but with revelation, the air thick with unspoken questions and uncomfortable self-reflection. For the first time all evening, Maya smiled. Not a wide, triumphant grin, but a subtle, almost imperceptible curve of her lips, just enough to cut through the heavy atmosphere with a quiet certainty, a silent acknowledgement of the power shift that had irrevocably altered the landscape of the room. The humiliation they had attempted to inflict upon her had been transformed into the very moment that exposed them all, revealing the ugliness that lay beneath the polished surface of their privileged existence. The reveal detonated like a fault line splitting open, and the aftershocks rippled across every corner of the ballroom, shaking the foundations of their social hierarchy. What once was laughter had turned into a silence sharp enough to cut skin, a palpable void filled with the unspoken weight of judgment. Every insult hurled minutes before now hung in the air like incriminating evidence, condemning their perpetrators. Charles Denton staggered a step back, his face a mask of bewilderment and dawning despair. His velvet jacket, once a symbol of authority and social standing, now looked like a costume worn by a man caught playing a role he didn't deserve, a charade exposed for all to see. His mouth opened as if to recover, to offer some explanation or excuse, but no words came, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before his very eyes. The MC's announcement had stripped him bare, exposing the hollowness of his authority. The Scarlet Woman's hand shook so violently that the champagne spilled across her wrist, the effervescent liquid now a symbol of her shattered composure. She tried to dab at it with a napkin, but her movements were frantic, desperate, exposing her panic more than concealing it. Her husband's silver hair no longer gleamed with confidence, the carefully cultivated image of effortless success now tarnished by the harsh light of reality. Sweat slicked his temples, his laughter long gone, replaced by a look of barely concealed anxiety. He whispered something sharp into her ear, something that sounded suspiciously like blame, his voice tight with suppressed anger. Around them, the crowd shifted like a tide, their allegiance wavering in the face of the changing power dynamics. Guests who had smirked and whispered now straightened their faces, tugging self-consciously at their collars, suddenly remembering they were on camera, their every reaction being recorded for posterity. Phones pointed not at Maya anymore, but at Charles and the Scarlet couple, their discomfort immortalized in the red recordings that pulsed ominously on each device. The pear-clad woman lowered her phone just long enough to whisper to her neighbor, her voice filled with a mixture of outrage and morbid fascination. "They humiliated the sponsor of the night in her own gala," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with disbelief. The neighbor nodded, his expression a mixture of shame and awe, the conflicting emotions warring within him. The young waiter stood frozen, the abandoned tray long forgotten, his chest heaving with a mixture of relief and exhilaration. He looked at Maya, not with pity, not with doubt, but with reverence, his gaze reflecting the transformative power of the moment. She had absorbed every insult, every dismissal, every subtle slight, and in one masterful stroke, had turned the stage into her own, seizing control of the narrative and rewriting the rules of the game. Charles finally found his voice, though it trembled, betraying his inner turmoil. I wasn't aware. If I had known." His excuses cracked and splintered before they even reached their conclusion, the words ringing hollow, a desperate scramble for footing on marble that had already given way, leaving him stranded and exposed. The Scarlet Woman attempted a laugh, the sound brittle and fragile as glass, teetering on the edge of hysteria. "It was a misunderstanding, of course," she declared, her voice laced with forced levity. "Just a little mistake." Maya's gaze cut toward her, sharp, measured, and final, silencing her with the force of its unwavering intensity. The laugh died in the woman's throat, unfinished and unconvincing. Phones captured it all. The pale faces, the trembling hands, the broken composure, the crumbling facades. The narrative had inverted completely, the accusers now the accused, the judges now the judged. They were no longer the arbiters of social grace, but rather the spectacle, their downfall playing out before the eyes of a captivated audience. Jordan stepped slightly closer to Maya, his presence solid and reassuring, a bulwark against the storm of emotions that raged around them. He didn't need to speak. The room had already spoken for them, the murmurs and whispers turning into a chorus of condemnation directed at Charles and the couple in scarlet. "Can you believe they said that to her?" Someone whispered, their voice laced with indignation. "She funds this entire event. They're finished." Another voice chimed in, the words carrying a sense of finality. The shift was complete, the balance of power irrevocably altered. Those who mocked were now mocked, those who judged were now judged. The stage belonged to Maya, not because she had seized it, but because they had handed it to her, unaware, unprepared, and ultimately unable to take it back. And as the silence deepened, as their collapse played out before every lens and every witness, one truth was undeniable. The power in the room had changed hands for good, shifting from the established elite to the woman who had been so readily dismissed. The ballroom had transformed into a court, and Maya was the only one fit to deliver the verdict, the sole voice of authority in a room filled with the echoes of their misjudgments. Every face was turned to her now, waiting not for her to defend herself, but to decide the fate of those who had tried to erase her, their futures hanging precariously in the balance. Maya took a single step forward, the sound of broken glass crunching beneath her heels slicing through the silence, commanding more attention than any gavel. She lifted her chin, her eyes narrowing on Charles Denton, her gaze unwavering and resolute. "You dared to call me uninvited," she said evenly, her voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed anger. "Yet this event would not exist without my signature. Without Caldwell Global's funding, there would be no scholarships, no programs, no stage for you to posture on." Charles's lips quivered, his carefully constructed composure finally shattering under the weight of her words. I didn't know," he stammered, his excuse weak and unconvincing. Maya didn't let him finish, cutting him off with a dismissive wave of her hand. "You didn't care to know?" she retorted, her voice laced with disdain. "And ignorance is not an excuse. It's negligence, a willful blindness that speaks volumes about your character." Her gaze shifted to the scarlet-clad couple, their faces now etched with a mixture of fear and regret. They wilted under her scrutiny, their shoulders sagging, their eyes darting nervously toward the exits as though escape might still be possible. "You," Maya said, her voice cutting clean through the remaining pretense. "You mocked me in front of this room. You laughed at the idea that I belonged. And yet, you've spent years lobbying for Caldwell contracts. You've begged for meetings you never received, all while secretly despising the hand that feeds you." The Scarlet Woman shook her head desperately, tears welling in her eyes. We were only joking," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "Justice is not a joke," Maya interrupted, her words as sharp as shards of glass, yet delivered with an air of unwavering composure. "And your attempts at humor have revealed the true depths of your prejudice." Jordan's phone buzzed softly in his hand. He lifted it, glanced at the screen, then handed it to her, his movements fluid and efficient, a silent display of unwavering support. Maya tapped once, her expression unchanging, her eyes fixed on the scarlet couple. "Marcus, lock their accounts. Effective immediately. Suspend all pending contracts. Freeze negotiations. Flag tonight's footage for legal review." The words hung heavy in the air, each syllable a death knell for their carefully constructed world. Gasps erupted from the crowd. The collective intake of breath, a symphony of shock and disbelief. Charles paled further, his face now ashen with the realization of the impending consequences. The scarlet couple clutched at each other, their faces contorted with horror, their carefully constructed facade of wealth and privilege crumbling before their very eyes. And then, as if on cue, Jordan's phone lit up again, the speakerphone automatically activating, filling the silence with the sound of confirmation. A voice, calm and professional, spilled from the speaker, its tone devoid of emotion. Confirmed. Their access has been revoked. Documentation logged. Effective now. Read. That was the word on every face, the unspoken color of shame and consequence. Charles's cheeks burned crimson with humiliation, the flush of anger replaced by the pallor of fear. The scarlet woman's gown seemed suddenly too on the nose, a costume marking her guilt, a sartorial symbol of her impending downfall. Her husband's cuff dripped with red wine where his hand had trembled, a stain that seemed to symbolize the blood on their hands, the price they would pay for their arrogance and prejudice. Maya's eyes swept the crowd once more, taking in every detail, every nuance of their reactions. "I will not tolerate disrespect," she declared, her voice resonating with unwavering conviction. "Not toward myself, and not toward anyone who looks like me, dresses like me, or stands in a room they're told they don't belong in. Tonight, let this serve as precedent. Disrespect has consequences, immediate and final." The young waiter exhaled sharply, almost a sob of relief, his eyes shining with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. Guests murmured amongst themselves, their voices rising not against her, but in support, a chorus of newfound respect and understanding. The pear-clad woman began clapping first, her movements slow and deliberate, her face etched with a mixture of shame and admiration. Others followed, tentatively at first, then with increasing enthusiasm, a wave of sound building until it filled the hall with thunderous applause, a testament to the transformative power of Maya's words. Maya didn't bow, didn't smile wide, didn't offer any gesture of humility. She stood tall, absorbing the applause not as flattery but as confirmation, her silence speaking volumes. Her judgment had been delivered, and it was irreversible, a line drawn in the sand that could not be erased. The applause thundered through the ballroom, echoing off the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, rattling the very foundations of the building, as if even the inanimate objects bowed to the shift of power, acknowledging the dawn of a new era. But Maya raised her hand just slightly, a subtle gesture that nevertheless commanded attention, and the noise softened into silence, not forced or coerced, but voluntary. The kind of silence born when every soul in the room realizes they are standing in the presence of something greater than spectacle, something more profound than mere wealth or social standing. Maya looked out over the crowd, her gaze encompassing every individual, from Charles, trembling in his velvet jacket, his armor now a cage trapping him in his own shame, to the scarlet couple, their arrogance melted into shame, their eyes darting about like cornered prey, searching for an escape that did not exist. She looked at the guests who had laughed, whispered, and doubted, their faces now etched with a mixture of unease and self-reproach. She looked at the few who had filmed, who had stood uneasy, who had begun to question the status quo, their silence now replaced by a glimmer of hope. Her voice was calm, low, but it rolled like thunder across the hall, reaching every ear, penetrating every heart. "You tried to write me out of this room," she stated, her voice unwavering and resolute. "But you failed to realize I built this room. Every chandelier above you, every table beneath your hands, every dollar pledged tonight is here because I chose it, because I believed in something bigger than myself." Her eyes lingered on the scarlet woman, her gaze unwavering and unflinching. "You measured me by my dress," she stated, her voice devoid of malice, yet filled with a quiet determination. She turned to Charles, her eyes piercing through his carefully constructed facade. "You measured me by my silence," she declared, her words carrying the weight of unspoken truths. Then, she turned to the crowd at large, her gaze encompassing every individual in the room. "You measured me by what you thought power should look like, she stated, her voice resonating with quiet authority. But power does not shout. Power does not beg. Power simply is. The young waiter stood straighter now, his eyes wide with admiration, his chest swelling with pride that wasn't his alone, but shared, contagious, spreading through the room like wildfire. Around him, other guests shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had laughed too soon, judged too easily, their initial impressions clouded by prejudice and preconceived notions. Maya's gaze softened slightly, the edges of steel tempered by something deeper, something more profound than mere anger or resentment. "I don't need cameras," she declared, her voice resonating with unwavering conviction. "I don't need applause. I don't even need your approval. I stand here because my work, my vision, and my dignity put me here, and that is something no mockery can erase." The chandeliers glinted, the light cascading down like a crown over her head, illuminating her face with an almost ethereal glow. She took one final breath, then let the words fall with the weight of stone, the final pronouncement of her judgment. "Remember this night," she said, her voice echoing through the hall. "Not because of what was said to me, but because of what it revealed about you, about all of us. And know this, I am not the exception. I am the result." Silence roared, filling the room with its deafening presence. Then, the applause returned, building slowly at first, then surging forward with unstoppable force. Not scattered, not hesitant, but tidal, crashing over the crowd, washing away the remnants of prejudice and preconceived notions. Guests rose from their chairs, one by one, until the entire room was standing. A standing ovation not just for her wealth or her title, but for her unshakable presence, her unassailable truth, her unwavering commitment to justice. Charles slumped in his chair, defeated, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his humiliation. The scarlet couple shrank into the shadows, their arrogance and self-importance replaced by a palpable sense of shame and regret. But Maya stood taller than ever, her head held high, the embodiment of justice carried out not by force but by composure, her silence speaking louder than any words could ever convey. Jordan stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers, a silent gesture of support and affirmation. Together, they turned toward the exit, not as guests leaving a gala, but as owners leaving their hall, their departure a silent testament to the power of resilience and the enduring triumph of truth. And as the ovation surged behind them, the message crystallized in every witness's mind, etched into their memories forever. Dignity does not need a microphone. Justice does not need permission. It only needs the courage to stand and the silence to let truth do the rest.